These Small Hours with Russell Cordell Staker. My friends, this is the Small Hours podcast, and I am Russell Cordell Staker. I'm glad you're here with me. It's the 16th of February, 2022. I'm coming to you from Austin, Texas, and I hope that wherever my voice is going out tonight, it reaches you and finds you well. Unfortunately for me, I am coming through the last remnants of a bit of a cold, so you're going to hear that in my voice. I'm a one-man show. I checked with my producer, and he said, it's okay, let's do it anyway. Made me wonder about Howard Stern when he's got a cold. Who makes that decision? Tonight, I'm going to read a piece that was published on russellcordellstaker.substack.com earlier today. This is an ongoing column that I'm going to be doing, and I wanted to read that here tonight. So sit back. Please enjoy. It Doesn't Matter, Part 2. Keep a running list of books and plays read. By Russell Cordell Staker. At the outset of what I would describe as my reading life, which began in earnest at the age of 9, I discovered Louis L'Amour. He wasn't the first writer I would very nearly wholly consume, but he remains what I might describe as my first true guide. As I consider it, some of my earliest and clearest memories are of books. There are a series of images seared in my mind in which I'm holding a book in my hands, of putting my nose into its pages because I like the way it smells, of turning its pages and narrating into the shape of words I hadn't quite learned how to read. Sure, many of those early books had pictures, but I was never too much concerned with those. It was the structure of the sentences just underneath them that held my curiosity. A form of magic and alchemy I'm still deciphering and pursuing all these many years later, and with every new book I read. Reading didn't naturally come to me at first. In fact, I was slow to pick it up in the classroom. I was well aware of certain girls who could read the Dick and Jane books without the aid of Mrs. Hogaboom in kindergarten at Lincoln Elementary School. I wasn't jealous of those girls, but their independent literacy frustrated me because I had a bigger need to know what the books in my room back home had to tell me. And I wasn't going to get to discover any of it for myself until I could adequately read on my own. Sure, my parents read to me, but I wanted to know for myself how to navigate those pages and speak what the printed ink wanted my mouth to say, my mind and heart to understand. I resolved to work harder to get it right. It was a genuine and pure desire, the first, I think, I can attest to ever truly having of and for myself. With a little persistence, I succeeded, and soon enough flourished as a young reader. I became one of the best in the first grade and onward from there. Much like a leggy young colt finally breaking out of the pen to run at his own pace over all that wild terrain against the wind and horizon, my ability to finally read was the escape. Once out, I never returned to the old pen. I must have come trailing some old glory because in addition to reading, I had a sense for the Old West. I loved watching John Wayne Westerns with my dad. Wayne's West was my land too. I was born in Utah, grew up and lived in the Mountain West of that state, and Idaho and Colorado too. Even now, when I watch John Wayne saunter across the lens of John Ford's Panavision against the backdrop of Monument Valley, I feel like I am home. It's a bone-deep recognition, but as grand as film was and remains, it wasn't until I started reading Louis L'Amour at the age of 9 that something more authentic clicked in my heart. I sensed a complete praxis of image and essence with language in a space that embodied the heritage that formed me into this mortal world. Lamore put into my mouth the taste of the beans and tobacco, the scent of the horse and the kick of the rifle, the pursuit of the frontier and the hope of an America I was going to take a part in bringing to its fullest and best self. More than all of this, though, was the mentoring, way down beneath the words that told me that I, too, was a writer of the American West, that one day I'd write a few of my own books, too. And this is happening. For now, though, I want to focus on one simple and profound habit that I learned to keep and honor from Mr. Louis L'Amour himself. At the back of his memoir, Education of a Wandering Man, he offered me something that changed my life. He provided a series of reading lists he kept from the 1930s during his hobo years, traveling about, boxing, and doing whatever work came his way until he started writing stories of his own. By the time I completed reading his memoir and came upon that particular section, a complete and serendipitous moment of surprise to me, I had very nearly read some 50 of his books. I would eventually read them all. But nothing meant more to me than to see the lists he kept during those years of the writers and titles he'd read. Sometimes in life we discover something, usually small in the worldly sense, that offers a truth so profound that to possess it means only to somehow embody and personify it. I did just that, and from that moment on, to have been shown by a writer I had so completely loved how much he loved what he read, and to be inspired to keep a list of my own for myself, just as he had done for himself, was as prized a possession as any I have ever been given. That very afternoon, I sat down and began to keep a list of what I had read in 1989, and in the years to come, I have continued to do so. At the beginning of each year, I look forward to writing the new year at the top of a page, knowing that I have the year in front of me to fill it with the names of books and their writers I will get to know, through the very sentences they crafted, and secretly, I believe, only for me to read. Sometimes I wonder why I keep the list. Does it matter that I have it? Not really. Will anyone want to know what is on the list I've kept of all the things I've read? Probably not. But that is beside the point. To read is to roam. To read is to taste the sweet and the bitter of life with greater sense of the senses themselves. To list the books I've read is to remind myself every time I step out the front door that I've filled my heart and my head with language to meet and match the grandeur of the experience that will be mine as I navigate in and through the world I step out into. Reading isn't for everybody, but I wish that it was. I'm not alone in suggesting that this world would be far less maddening if more people simply decided to read. But I also realize that to read requires a form of will that is nurtured, and it takes time. I don't read to be important. I don't read to be smart. I don't read to be better than anyone. I read because reading reminds me of who I am. I am a writer. Yes, somehow I knew this even at an early age and long before I was really a reader. I can't explain it. I too am a storyteller. I am a chronicler of my time and the small, insignificant space I take up along the endless line of this moment in this world's history. I've taken up the call to contribute a little bit of my own verse as an echo of my time. And in order to more fully do this in the manner and hope of my literary desires is to first be a good enough reader to test the measure of my voice against and amongst the chorus of voices I've spent a lifetime getting to know, getting to sing in the shape of my mouth, that their words have been spoken in my voice, and maybe, one day, my words will be spoken in yours, and those of our children on down the infinite and expansive line of this world and its veiled gray curtain. In the end, what I read, what I write, is not of any great import, other than to suggest that it marked my passage through this time before I end up in the cosmos where the stars keep shining, and the great mystery of the Great Divide promises to remain a magnificent mystery forevermore. So, my dear reader, do yourself a favor. If you're not already doing so, begin keeping a list of everything you've completed reading. And remember, a list is only as exciting and curious as the promise of what you get to add to it after you've read that next book. The well is deep. It is pure and cold and delicious. Drink from it and record every cup you've swallowed. I promise you, your life will be richer and happier for having done so. It doesn't matter, but deep down, you'll know otherwise once you start doing it. You will live a meaningful life. RCS, 16 February, 2022. Austin, Texas. And that is my essay from my column, It Doesn't Matter. As I mentioned in the last podcast, I was introducing this new column that I'm running on russellcordellstaker.substack.com. If you go directly to that, or you can go to my website, thesmallhours.com, you can add your email to my email list. And every time I publish that column, and I've got another column that I'm going to be announcing forthcoming soon, as well as I've got a YouTube channel that I'm going to be building as well. So there's kind of a multi-pronged thing that's coming. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. I would love to have you as a subscriber. It's free. And every time I post one of those columns, it will go to your inbox. This podcast is a catch-all for all of the writing that I'm going to do, that I'm going to be sharing. Now, I am working on a novel, and there will be books and other things that I'm working on that I'm going to keep private to myself, because I'm also actively going to be submitting those for the traditional route to eventually achieve publication. So this is insight into this writer, and certainly I want to share this. This will be free, and the access is to build the readership. And I'm delighted that people are listening, and I'm delighted that you're listening right now. And the intent also is to offer something that inspires you to also take part in this great thing called literature, which is life-affirming, and it does so much for my life, and it's something I feel very passionately about. It makes me the grounded man that I am. And I do believe in due course that this lifelong endeavor is going to open other doors for me that will allow me to do it more fully, to support my family better with it, and on top of it, to help a lot of people along the way. So there is it's an act of giving and sharing, and there's a lot of what I'm producing that I'm giving away because I believe so strongly in it, and that's the purpose behind it. I want to briefly just share something with you about Louis L'Amour. So you obviously heard what I wrote, and I want to give a little more in-depth insight, which is not on the Substack column, but that's the beauty of running a podcast, is I can expand a little bit on where this writing comes from and why it's important. As I'd mentioned, Louis L'Amour was the first writer that I would say I completely consumed in terms of his literary output. I was so enamored with his storytelling, because it took me to a place that was important to me. And I could spend multiple podcasts talking about the American West, and eventually that's going to happen. I do have plans on writing my own Western at some point. There's a few books down the line that I've got lined up, and that is certainly something that I have every intention of writing, and it will be something that's going to be very personal to me because of how powerfully those stories integrated into my life, and a fully imagined great Western story that I have plans to write. But what I wanted to mention about Louis L'Amour is that he, as a guide for me, enabled me to take on reading at a different level. So when I came to Louis L'Amour, I was 9 years old. I didn't seriously start reading novels per se until about 9. I think prior to that, I dabbled. Of course, I was a very intuitive reader. And as far back as I can think, maybe 6, which is when words started to make sense to me. And certainly by the time I got into first grade, of course, I could start reading full sentences. Prior to that, I would, on my own as a little tiny kid, and there's pictures of me actually, and I wish I could find them. My mom, or I don't know who's got them, but there are photos of me with my sisters. I'm the oldest of 4. And, I'm reading these books to them, which, I didn't know how to read. And in some of the photos, I'm holding the book upside down, but you can tell that I'm waxing lyrical as I'm narrating whatever I think the words are saying to my sisters. Reading is just something that just from a very early age I took to. But by the time I got to the age of 9, there was something that shifted inside of me, and I recognized a deeper need to have to hold bigger books and to wade into them and to understand what the sentences and the paragraphs and the pages led to. And I was starting to also, without being able to put this in words at the time, I certainly can now, I'm 47, but at the age of 9, I was paying attention to voice. We hear that a lot when we talk about literary ambition. What's that writer's voice? And I think sometimes it becomes very cliche. For me, it was very personal. Voice to me it's the sound, of course, but it's the insight within the voice. And for me, it's an intimacy with that particular writer where I feel that there is a connection. When I'm reading those sentences, that I feel as if I've been brought into that writer's headspace or heart space, and given access to something as they are creating it that nobody else has. And that's what I felt with Louis L'Amour. And it's continued on with so many writers throughout my life. And again, that's something that I can continue to talk about and certainly will, It's something that I'm doing as I'm doing my own writing now. When I sit down to write a sentence, I'm not just thinking about the sentence. I'm also thinking about, am I allowing my voice in the imagined state of what it is I'm creating, or if I'm writing an essay, or if it's something personal in terms of a memory that still transcends me physically writing that, so that the person that's going to read it or hear it feels as if they have access inside of Russell Cordell Staker as he's creating that. And Louis L'Amour was the first writer that did that for me. His ability to capture the essence of the American West as he saw it. And of course, there's multiple versions. As of right now, I'm currently doing an immersive chronological reading of Larry McMurtry, who I consider the Chaucer of the American West. And of course, I'm a grown-up man, and I have a different level of understanding and nuance of life that Larry McMurtry is just a delight, because he kind of turns the whole Western mythology upside its head. Louis L'Amour is, certainly more of a traditional writer. And, at some point, I'm probably going to go back and reread those books. I've often heard many writers talk about writers that were important to them early in their lives, and then they go back to them later in life, and maybe that writer doesn't hold up in the same vein, and primarily because that the writer who was the reader at the time that they first came to that particular writer has grown up and has different experiences and certainly viewpoints, and on top of that sees the world in a broader, more adult way. I have no doubt that when I read L'Amour again, there will be certain things that I'll be like, yeah, it maybe doesn't resonate the way it did, but there will always be a deep reverence for Louis L'Amour because of what he did for me as a kid, and the broad, bright frontier of the American West that he gave me access to, and I couldn't get enough of it. And so in reading him, he also gave me liberty to realize that this is limitless. There is no end to this. And I was just mesmerized by the fact that he could sit down at a typewriter and create so many stories. I think he wrote well over 100 novels, some 250 short stories. He wrote essays, did articles. He was just prolific. But it took him a while to get started too. And so this leads back to what I wrote about in that column today, in talking about when I came to his memoir in 1989. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Louis L'Amour, if I remember correctly, and I didn't verify this on Google, but I believe he died in 1988. So the year before he died, he'd finished this memoir, and it wasn't actually published until he had passed on and moved on. And so when I got the book, Education of a Wandering Man, I would have been, if I'm doing my math right, I think I was 15. Hang on, I'm going to take a sip of water. And of course, at that point, I'd read some 50 of his books. And so I was very hungry for this opportunity to read this book. And before I share what I'm going to say with this particular avenue, I've got to step back a little bit here. When I was 12, so 3 years before the moment I'm about to just describe to you in reading his memoir after he's passed on, I wrote him a letter. And in the letter, I told him that I was the great-grandson of Howard Roscoe Driggs, who was a great historian and writer of the American West. He was one of the founders of Southern Utah University in Cedar City. So this is on my mom's side of the family. And one of his sons, H. Wayne Driggs, was my grandfather. Now, I didn't know either of those men in this life. They had passed on before I was born. They were responsible for marking the Pony Express and doing a lot of extensive writing about that. The great book that Howard R. Driggs wrote was published in, I believe it was 1949, and it's called Westward America. And I have one of the original copies of that. And he worked with a gentleman who did the lithograph photography by the name of Jackson, who did these wonderful drawings that went with this book. And it's a history basically of the Mormon pioneers. I come from a Mormon heritage. I have no affiliation with the Mormon church now, but it's in my DNA, and I come from that background. And it's a description of the movement west forward. Certainly takes into account the broad west, not just the Mormon aspect of this, but he wrote about that extensively. And then in this book, Jackson did these wonderful lithograph. I'm probably saying it wrong. And as I'm talking, the book is right across the room from me. I can see it in my library, and I wasn't prepared prior to starting this podcast. Otherwise, I'd pull it out right now. But I'm going to go off the hip. I've read the book a couple of times, and my great-grandfather, it was an important work. So anyway, when I was 12, I was aware of all of these things, not to the extent that I am now, but I also had this great love of Louis L'Amour. So I sat down and I wrote him a letter, and I mailed it to his publisher at Bantam Books. And I wish I had that original letter because I don't know exactly all that I said, but I remember telling him who I was in terms of who my great-grandfather was. So I send it off, and a few months later, I get a letter back. And in my memory, I would have mailed that probably in February, about this time frame in 1986. And on June 22nd, 1986, I got a brown envelope in my mailbox. I lived on Lima Way in Inglewood, Colorado at that time, and I'm 12. I just recently turned 12 the month before. And this is what it says. And I have this letter is framed in my writing office to this day. It's on Louis L'Amour's letterhead. And the signature at the bottom, which he signed in a brown felt pen, is faded, but I can still see his signature at the very bottom. But this is the letter that he wrote in response to my 12-year-old Russell Cordell Staker letter to him. Louis L'Amour, June 22nd, 1986. Dear Russell Staker, it was good to hear from you. I'm usually so busy with writing and research that I have little time for letters, but I like getting them, and yours was a pleasure. I am familiar with Howard R. Drigg's book, Westward America, which is very well thought of by Western authorities. He contributed some important material on the history of the West. It is doubly a pleasure to know you are his grandson. Much of what there is to know about me is told in the note in my books. At present, I have a home in Los Angeles and a ranch in Colorado, and I have interests in New Mexico. I've traveled all over the West, and as a teenager, I worked on ranches, then in mines and lumber camps, and at sea. Times were hard, and I had to make my living at whatever came to hand. Passin' Through was laid on my own ranch, except for the parts that took place in the now vanished town of Parrott City. He's speaking of a novel that I had read called Passin' Through, and I must have referenced that book because he's referencing it back. And I seem to remember that I can still see the cover of that book. I seem to remember that I was reading that at the time I would have written him that letter. So anyway, he says, and in the trip across the hills when Passin was wounded. Your grandfather's book was illustrated by Jackson, one of the first photographers in the West. I shall be in Colorado Springs in July as I am speaking to the Western Governors Conference there. The 16 governors from Western states and 3 territories will be there. After that, I'm going to the ranch for a few quiet days just to write and to work around the place. I will be on the Merv Griffin Show on July 2nd in case you are watching. All the best, Louis L'Amour. And he has that perfect signature, which I was familiar with before I got this, and it's got the little loopy L and on both the first and the last name. But what a beautiful, beautiful letter. I was stunned. It just took my breath away. Louis L'Amour, even if he hadn't have written that letter back to me, he cemented his meaning to me in my life by taking the time to write that letter. And sadly enough, he passed away, I think just 2 summers later. So I believe it was 1988. So now let me get back to what I was starting to tell you. So in 1989, when his book, Education of a Wandering Man, comes out, which I've read, I think 13 or 14 times, and I'm going to read it again. It's on my reading desk to get back into because I love that book so much. That book was like manna from heaven, because in the letter, which I just read to you, he describes in generality much of what he gets more in depth about in that actual memoir. And so I was already privy to something that, nobody else, or, of course I was a 12-year-old boy. I'm sure a lot of people that followed L'Amour might have known. But to me, I felt like I'd already been given keys to access a kingdom that was his prior to him even writing that memoir. And when I held that book, knowing that he had moved on from this life and he was wherever we go after this great divide is crossed, I felt as if that connection, which had been formed through the years of my earlier youth and reading, certainly through the letter that I exchanged, the one that I wrote to him and he wrote back, I felt as if now he was speaking to me directly from the other side. And so that book was powerful because he talks about his hoboing, which, it has a negative connotation in today's world, but hobos back in the day, they were itinerant workers. They were hard workers, but they did what they could. They moved on through the country to find work where work was to be had. And they were generally very stand-up men and women that did their work because they were just trying to survive. And he was a hobo. He was also a boxer, but he was an avid reader through all of that. And much of that book, he's describing the time that he took to always be reading. And so when I got to the very end of the book, he provides lists of books that he read, books and plays that he had read through much of the 1930s. And I'm not going to say I got weepy because I was 15. I was still kind of a petulant teenager, I guess, but it was extremely important to me to see that. It did more for me to see those lists of what he had read than all of the books I've read of Louis L'Amour. And the reason for that is that I realized, and of course he talks about this in his book, Education of a Wandering Man, I realized what an adept and broad and deep reader he was. He read the classics. I'm getting emotional talking about this because to me, I thought, here is this dude, this great American Western writer who has written novels that are so important to me as a kid, who spurred this passion for me to read other writers. And when I saw that, it was as if he gave me another key. I'm sorry. Let me get a sip of water. Hang on. And that other key was permission, where he led by example in saying that, yeah, I write these American West novels, but I've read all the greats as well. And that's the source from which he was deriving the language in which he told the stories of the places that he knew, the places that he walked, the places that he considered and dreamt about. It was also a hint as to what it really means to be a writer, that the language comes when we read. So I am so sorry. I get emotional about this. And actually, my wife tells me all the time, stop apologizing. So I'm going to do my best not to apologize because there's nothing to apologize for. My emotions are real because this is real. And what I write and what is coming, and certainly what I've developed and I'm so excited about and coming forward, is just an outlet of what's deeply embedded in my soul. And I want to share that with you. So that's my message tonight. I would love to have you subscribe to my newsletter. Continue to follow me on this podcast. You can go to my website, thesmallhours.com. In the near term, I'm developing an LLC that I mentioned. There's a broader platform to what I'm doing with These Small Hours. The LLC is going to be Russell Cordell Staker LLC. There's some ancillary work that I'm going to be doing at the writing level, but I'm pursuing the high art as well as some functionary work as a writer and as an advisor with what it is that I'm doing. And there's also going to be a YouTube channel tied to this with some ideas that I'm putting together around organizational behavior and certain things from my previous experience that I think will also lend themselves well into the broader working world as well. So there are multiple tiers that are coming. And over the course of the next months, this broader, expansive thing that I've been building is going to start to show in broader ways. So I'm very excited about it. And last but not least, I'm hard at work on a great novel right now. I'm very, very excited about it. This is a big, fully imagined book, and I'm just letting it rip. I'm going to kind of look at this as a coming out party. I wish I could say it was going to come fast, but it's probably going to be a project I'm going to be working on into early part of next year before I'm probably going to be in a position to show it to anybody. But I'm working on it and got some great essays coming as well. But I'm going to also share these little column pieces that I'm writing. So I hope you have a wonderful night. Thank you for being a listener. And please, wherever you are, take good care of yourself. Reach out to people all across different lifestyles and perspectives. And especially for those of you out here in America, just remember, you know what? We're all Americans. And I think particularly at this time in the world, let's just try to remind each other that we share the same blood, same beating heart. And it's okay to have differences of opinion, but boy, this is a great country, and we'll be better if we can just listen to each other a little bit more and talk a little bit less. And here I am talking, and I'm not really listening at this particular moment because I'm podcasting, but I want you to know that I really strive to be a great listener. And that's where reading is so important, is that it puts me into a listening state where I can hear the voice of a writer who's taken the time to consider the nuance of the life that they're sharing with me in the imagined state, as well as in the direct state of the things that he or she is sharing. So be a great reader, keep a great list of the books that you read, and strive to let that experience really drive opportunity to open doors for other people and to be the best kind of human being you can be. Until next time, have a wonderful evening. Talk to you soon. Thank you for being with me here in these small hours.